My name's Fred D'Agostino. I'm Professor of Humanities at the University of Queensland, and I'd like to talk today about the glamour of grammar. Glamour originally means a kind of enchantment or spell that makes everything appear beautiful. And grammar is the art of letters. And grammar can be glamorous because it creates a spell through the use of words that enables us to understand each other and ourselves. One of the things that I want to emphasize is that grammar is not just about rigid rules, although there are rules, and sometimes they need to be given due weight in our expression. Grammar is about style. It's about having a voice and being able to express what it is that you need to express in order to communicate your ideas and your goals and aspirations. The word style reminds me of the most famous grammar book, at least in my world. Growing up in the United States in the 1950s, everybody was exposed to a book called The Elements of Style by Strunk and White. E.B. White was a writer for The New Yorker, and you may have read his children's book, Charlotte's Web. He had been taught by William Strunk when he was an undergraduate student. And they put together a kind of manual for writers that is still published after, 70 years? I think it must be about 70 years in print. There's a new 4th edition. And their emphasis on the word style really is the tip-off, that grammar is about being stylish. It's not about being constipated. I think a lot of people think, well, I can't say what I want to say because I'm bound by these rigid rules of grammar. That's an unhelpful attitude towards grammar, and I hope that you'll have that dispelled in your studies in this course. I want to read a little bit from Strunk and White because this is a very pithy expression of their fundamental principles. Vigorous writing is concise. A sentence should contain no unnecessary words. A paragraph, no unnecessary sentences. For the same reason that a drawing should have no unnecessary lines, and a machine no unnecessary parts. This requires not that the writer make all his sentences short, or that he avoid all detail and treat his subjects only in outline, but that he make every word tell. Hemingway expressed it differently and with fewer words. Prose is architecture, not interior decoration. I'd like to give some examples of good writing that follows the dicta of Strunk and White and of Hemingway, but they're very different, as you'll hear. The first is from Henry James, a writer who's notorious for the length and complexity of some of his sentences. But I think you will see, and I hope that I can do justice to it as I read it, that he too uses no unnecessary word and says exactly what he means. It was not indeed to either of those places that these grounds of his predilection, after all sufficiently vague, had, at the moment we are concerned with him, guided his steps. He had strayed simply enough into Bond Street, where his imagination, working at comparatively short range, caused him now and then to stop before a window in which objects, massive and lumpish, in silver and gold, in the forms to which precious stones contribute, or in leather, steel, brass, applied to 100 uses and abuses, were as tumbled together as if, in the insolence of the empire, they had been the loot of far-off victories. One sentence. Short words, short clauses, a very clear picture, I think, emerges of the scene that's being described. but a complicated structure reflecting a complicated train of thought, a complicated scene of reminiscence or of experience. I might go to the other end of the spectrum and give an example from an American songwriter of the 1950s, Hank Williams, not to be confused with Hank Williams II or Hank Williams III. This is one of the most famous song lyrics in the American songbook. Hear that lonesome whippoorwill, he sounds too blue to fly. The midnight train is whining low, I'm so lonesome I could cry. I've never seen a night so long when time goes crawling by. The moon just went behind the clouds to hide its face and cry. Did you ever see a robin weep when leaves begin to die? Like me, he's lost the will to live. I'm so lonesome I could cry. The silence of a falling star lights up a purple sky, and as I wonder where you are, I'm so lonesome I could cry. One of the things that's uncharacteristic about this particular lyric of Hank Williams is that it contains two-syllable words. Lonesome, whippoorwill, there's actually 1, 2, 3, 3 syllables. And it's very unusual in his lyrics for him to use anything other than monosyllables. He was singing at a time before television. He was singing at a time when his audience was deracinated Southern and Midwestern Depression era farmers, and they had very restricted vocabularies and wouldn't have understood more complicated speech, even if he had been able himself to produce it, because he came from that stratum of society. And he spoke to them, and really timelessly, because of the simplicity of his prose. No word wasted, but again, as in the Henry James, a very clear picture. In this case, it's partly an interior picture, a picture of someone's feelings, but set against the background of very familiar and common features of the landscape in rural America. Part of the received wisdom of American prose style is that it all begins with Hemingway, and that in the 1920s, Hemingway introduced into American prose writing a kind of simplicity that contrasted very starkly with the labyrinthine sentence structure that we found in Henry James. The Hank Williams style really is, if you like, the refinement of the simplicity of Hemingway's prose. But I think you'll hear in this excerpt from Hemingway's most famous short story, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, some of that same concision of utterance. This is architecture, not interior decoration, even though he's talking about a room. Good night, the other said. Turning off the electric light, he continued the conversation with himself. It was the light, of course, but it is necessary that the place be clean and pleasant. You do not want music. Certainly you do not want music. Nor can you stand before a bar with dignity, although that is all that is provided for these hours. What did he fear? It was not a fear or dread. It was a nothing that he knew too well. It was all a nothing, and a man was a nothing too. It was only that, and light was all it needed, and a certain cleanness and order. Some lived in it and never felt it, but he knew it all. He smiled and stood before a bar with a shining, steam pressure coffee machine. We're pretty lucky here at the beginning of the 21st century to have lived at a time when one of the great prose writers of, indeed, one of the great poets of the English language has been active. And I refer to Bob Dylan of Minnesota, Greenwich Village, and Hollywood, California. Dylan was a student of Hank Williams and was a student of prose and poetry stylings. He was inspired by Allen Ginsberg, who was himself inspired by Walt Whitman. And there's kind of a lineage in our prose and poetry stylists that you can trace, and that should you become interested enough to aspire to being a prose or poetry stylist, that you will trace in your own work, in your own research, in your own activities. This is something actually that's very evident in the hip-hop genre as well. The hip-hop artists all have precursors, some of whom go back millennia, and of whom they are self-consciously aware. You may not be when you listen to them, but they are. There is a tradition of glamorous grammar, glamorous grammaticality, and Bob Dylan is a piece of that tradition and has doffed his hat to Walt Whitman, to Allen Ginsberg, to Hank Williams, and to others. And here's one of his most touching lyrics. They're selling postcards of the hanging. They're painting the passports brown. The beauty parlor is filled with sailors. The circus is in town. Here comes the blind commissioner. They've got him in a trance. One hand is tied to the tightrope walker. The other is in his pants. And the riot squad, they're restless. They need somewhere to go, as Lady and I look out tonight from Desolation Row. This is a very unusual piece of verbiage. It's not descriptive of an exterior scene, not entirely so anyway. It's not really about an interior flow of ideas or of emotions. Some of it's imagined, some of it's fantasized, but it's expressed in very real, concrete imagery. This is something that we can do with words when we know how to use them. We can create a scene that is a phantasmagorical scene, as indeed Desolation Row is meant to be, by using ordinary descriptive language, but in unusual and in some cases disturbing ways. So among the combination of images, some of them make a lot of sense. So the circus is in town. We kind of all know what that means. We might not know what it means to say they're selling postcards of the hanging, but actually there are such things, as horrible as that is to contemplate. So in the United States there was a kind of a horrible tradition of lynch mob rule in the southern and southern Midwestern states in the United States. And there are literally postcards that were made portraying the hangings of African American men from trees by the Ku Klux Klan. The beauty parlor is filled with sailors. Well, that's something that might happen nowadays, but it probably was an unusual scene even in Greenwich Village. So what we see here is the juxtaposition of two familiar ideas or two familiar realities: sailors in town on shore leave and a beauty parlor. We put one into the other where they don't normally belong, and we create some kind of issue for the listener to make sense of what it is that we've expressed.